Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at So gehst du nun, mein Jesu, hin, which translates to So go now, my Jesus. Today's chorale is very similar to yesterday's chorale in the sense that this is a harmonization of an otherwise originally sacred song for solo voice, which is why it is 500A, because it's associated with BWV 500. This particular chorale is also very interesting because of just the harmonic profile of everything that's going on, especially what's going on here in the hotspot. I've been calling it the hotspot because after all this time I've kind of come to realize that there's usually something interesting going on here. There's a lot of chromaticism, there's even some tonal ambiguity going on here, which is really fascinating. I'm still not 100% about exactly what's going on here, but the rest of the chorale is, somewhat straightforward. There are plenty of moments that are fairly defined, but a fair share of moments that are also up for debate. Lots of interesting things in this chorale, so we're just going to hop right into the analysis. We have two flats in the key signature. We start on G minor and we end on G major, so I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is G minor. That really isn't up for debate. Our first phrase ends in a half cadence in the key of G minor. Our next chord, G is a chord tone here, so we don't have to mark it, and then we get F sharp, D, A, and D, which is D major over F sharp, 5-6. Apologies here, we had a typo. This is actually an F natural, which makes a lot more sense out of the chord. We have D, F natural, B natural, and D, which is B diminished over D. We have like a secondary dominant here, maybe like 7-6 of 4. Because B is the leading tone to C, and instead of getting C minor, we get C major, E natural, G, C, and C, which is 4-6, but major, not minor. And then as we would expect this to sort of continue up melodic minor style, that line is sort of passed over to the tenor here, and the bass continues to go downward. So we have E flat, F sharp, A, and C. And if you take the aggregate of all of that, you have F sharp fully diminished 7th over E flat, which is 7-4-2. So 4 going to 7, fairly normative chord progression. Also, this is a passing 7th, so we'll mark that. G is a passing tone, and also G is a passing tone, and coincidentally that leaves us with a passing 4-6 chord. But where does this 4-2 chord resolve? We would expect it to resolve to 3 in first inversion, but it doesn't. It does resolve down by step, so we get the bass that we would expect, but the chord we get in turn is D, A, F sharp, and D, which is our 5 chord. Very fascinating chord progression. 7 going to 5 is really just a big dominant anyways. Usually when we get chords that are a third apart like this, there's usually a buffer tone or even a buffer chord in between the two of them. So I sort of I look at this as like 4 going to 7 as sort of a separate idea, and 4 going to 5 as their own idea here. But you could also just interpret this just as sort of a big dominant progression that will presumably resolve to our tonic, or so we'd think. This chorale is very unusual. But yeah, after our 5 chord, we get C sharp, E, G, and B flat, which is another 7 chord, this time a secondary dominant, a secondary leading tone chord more specifically. This would be 7-7 of 5. This is definitely a half cadence. And then we get another interesting thing. We have D, A, D, and A, which is our 5 chord, but you might be noticing that this chord is missing a 3rd, and there are chorales that we've seen in the past that have had open 5ths, but there are so many open 5ths in proportion to what we expect in Bach's writing in this chorale. It sort of brings in into question whether or not Bach even harmonized this chorale, and maybe it got slipped into the collection without Bach having composed it, and there are notes on BachChorales.com that go into more detail about that. But, you know, the open fifths is definitely a red flag, and also just the chord progressions themselves are sort of wonky in terms of what we would expect from Bach. But yes, maybe this is a harmonization of a melody that Bach wrote and someone else harmonized it, maybe a student or an associate. It's difficult to say. But moving to the next phrase, we don't ever get a resolution to this half cadence like we would typically expect. We actually get a direct modulation to the key of B flat, where instead of going to G minor like we would expect, we go to B flat major, D, F, D, and A. Sorry, not B flat major. I was talking about the key of B flat major. We go from D major to D minor. Even though this is an open fifth, we're interpreting it as a D major chord because this has the same effect as a half cadence would, and in the key of G minor, we're expecting D major, and we don't have any reason to believe this would be D minor because the previous iterations of D chords in this phrase were major chords. So this is a D minor chord, and the reason why I think it's a direct modulation and not a common chord modulation is because of the juxtaposition of the two qualities, major, right, air quotes there, but major and minor. But after our 3 chord, we get G minor, G, B flat, D, and B flat. So G minor is now our 6, but 3 going to 6 is a normative progression we would expect in a tonal work, so that's good. We then get A, F, F, and C, which is 5, 6, F major, and then we get B flat, B flat, B flat, F, and D, tonic triad, root position, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get G, B flat, G, and E flat, which is E flat major over G. It's 4, 6. Passing tones in the outer voices, which actually gives us kind of an interesting passing chord here. We have F, B flat, G, and D, which is G minor 7 over F, which would technically be 6, 4, 2. And we would expect that to resolve to some type of 2-6 chord, and it does, but it's sort of disguised because the analysis wouldn't directly lead you to that conclusion, because we have E natural here, C, G, and C. The bass does resolve down by step. It's just a half step, not a whole step like we would expect, because if we're in the key of B flat, we would expect E flat, not E natural. So we get E natural here, and this would be 5, 6 of 5 rather than 2, 6, which is typically what we would expect in a perfect authentic cadence, which is what we have going on here. But 6, 4, 2 going to 5, 6 of 5 is a roundabout way of just saying 2, 6, except the 2 chord is major rather than minor, and functionally speaking, it is the dominant of 5. So we analyze it as 5 of 5, but really all the criteria are being crossed off here. 5th away, and the roots are a 5th away, and the bass is down by step. Passing tone here in the tenor before we get F, E flat, F, and C. Another open 5th chord here, but this time we have the 7th, which is very interesting, so we'll put figured bass there to reflect that. 5, 7, 5 instead of 5, 7, 3, which would be the much more common iteration of the chord that we would expect if a tone were omitted. A little anticipation here in the melody, and then we get B flat, D, F, and B flat. Tonic triad, root position. Next phrase maintains the key of B flat. We get an imperfect authentic cadence. We start off with C minor, E flat, C, G, and C, which is 2, 6. Then we get F, 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 and C. It makes me think that I have a typo there, but no, the 2 Fs are technically doubled because the bass and the bass and the tenor are singing the same note, but we're still getting 5 here, just no A. Passing 7th in the bass. C is a chord tone here in the tenor, so we don't have to mark it. And then we get D, F, F, and C. And this starts a string of 2 consecutive cadences that are very interesting in terms of, satisfying this authentic cadence narrative that's going on here. We have D minor 7 over, no, it's actually just D minor 7 in root position, so 3, 7. This C is actually a passing 7th, which is a chord tone in this case, so I will not mark it, but E flat is a passing tone. And if you take the aggregate of the tones, And this sort of goes against my general MO when I'm analyzing subdivided chord progressions, but I make exceptions when there's reason to do so. Typically, I only analyze subdivided chord progressions if the entire chord is intact. Like if we look here, for instance, we have an entirely spelled C minor chord. If these G's were C's, we could infer that it was a passing C minor chord, but if I'm really going to be saying that there's a chord progression going on and it isn't just coincidentally tones that could potentially be interpreted as a C minor chord, I would tend to leave it out. But here we have an incomplete F7 chord. We have C, E flat, F, and C, and it's also one of those open fifth chords. So we have F7 over C, which would be 5-4-3. The seventh, the third is omitted, and then we get B flat, D, F, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. So this 3-5-1 progression, this isn't entirely foreign. I wouldn't say that these cadences are wholly unique in terms of the Roman numeral analysis, because we have seen 3-5-1 cadences in the past in Bach, but it is very interesting. It's also very interesting that three chords often get positioned near five chords in second inversion. Like 5-3 going to 5-4-3 is a somewhat uncommon but still seen progression, because three chords are somewhat rare in proportion to the rest of the Roman numerals. But the fact that we're seeing it contextualized around a 4-3 chord is interesting. Or I guess more specifically a second inversion chord. I think that that's the bigger picture here, because the next phrase is going to illustrate a very similar structure. So we're going to get a direct modulation to the key of G minor at the beginning of the phrase, but we end with an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of C minor. So we only have 4 beats going on here, but Bach is going to modulate to the key of C minor before the end. We have D, C, F sharp, and D, another incomplete chord. It's a 5-7, and then we get G minor, G, B flat, G, and D, tonic triad. And here's what's really interesting. We have passing seventh in the bass, passing tone in the tenor. Then we get E flat, G, G, and D, which is E flat major 7 in the key of G minor. That's 6-7. But in the key of C minor, it is 3-7, and it's happening metrically at the same point as the previous phrase. But we have this passing seventh going on in the bass here. But look what the passing seventh does to the chord. At 3 going to 1, isn't really traditionally a authentic cadence, even though it can be, like if you were using an augmented chord that had that B natural rather than a B flat, that would want to resolve to C. But we have a 3-7 chord going to D, G, G, and D, which would be a 5 chord in passing in second inversion. And pardon me if the figured bass is incorrect. I'm using the interpreted or my interpretation of the chord, even though not all of the tones are present. We have D natural, G, G, and D. Lots of open fifths in this chorale, and like I said, one of two things is happening. Either this is not Bach's chorale writing or harmonization, because it's just unusual to see him use so many open fifths, or maybe there is a miscopying going on here and this was an incomplete transcript. Maybe there was some type of accompaniment going on that would fill out the rest of the voices, and these open fifths would be explained by another instrument filling in the thirds, because Bach has done that in the past too with his pieces that have instrumental accompaniment, like horns and violins, flutes, etc. I've analyzed all of those chorales if you want to check them out. There are earlier videos. But we have a 3 chord going to a second inversion 5 chord. Doesn't have the 7th, but it's still second inversion. And then we go to C minor, which is our tonic triad in the key of C minor, C, C, G, and E flat. And also I'm just realizing now that I forgot the fermata markings over the first phrase here. For some reason it only made it over the melody. Hopefully that didn't distract you too much. But moving on to the next system, for the most part, we're going to be moving to the key of G minor again, where we get a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G minor here, with more chromaticism in the bass going on here at the beginning of the system. We start off with what I believe to be a modulation to the key of G minor. We have a 4 chord, or our tonic in the key of C minor is being respelled or reinterpreted, sorry, not respelled, it's the same spelling, reinterpreted as 4 in the key of G minor. And then we get D major, D, A, D, and D. Another open fifth, which is, again, interesting. Tons of open fifths in this chorale, which is D major, interpreting it as our 5 chord, of course, because we're in the key of G minor. And then we get E flat, G, and C, which is C minor in first inversion. A bit of a deceptive progression here, but it looks like 5 is being contextualized as a chord in a greater string of chords that are filling out G minor. So G minor is the end point, but there are going to be some chords in the meantime. But 4-6 is going to take us to kind of a unique progression here. We have E natural, G, and B flat. So it's more common for us to see C major as a chord with the E natural in it, but here we see 6 diminished. It's not super uncommon, but it's less common than seeing our 4 chord with major as a major quality rather than a minor, rather than a diminished 6 chord. But still, if you take a 6 chord and you spell it in the melodic minor scale, you get a diminished quality chord as opposed to a major quality chord. And then we get a bit of an interpretable chord here. We have F sharp, D, A, and A. I'm going to say this is 5-6, but if you look at this C not as a passing 7th, but as the 5th of the chord, you could say that this is a root position 7 chord, and this is just adjacent harmony, 6 going to 7, and then 7 going to 1. But 5-6 versus 7, it's really just 6 of one, half dozen of another. We see 5 and 7 contextualized near one another with some frequency in Bach. Usually it's with 5-7 and 7-7, but here we're seeing it with the triads. That's totally valid too. But afterwards we get G, B flat, G, and B flat, our tonic triad in root position G minor without the 5th. Interesting that we have a chord with the 5th omitted with so many chords that have the 3rd omitted. But afterwards we get a passing 7th in the alto. G is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. We get C sharp, A, E, and A, which is another secondary dominant. It's going to be 5-6 of 5 because A major is the dominant of D, and D is our 5 in the key of G minor. Passing tone here in the tenor before we get D, C, D, and A. Another one of these open 5th, 7th chords. We've seen these before in the past, namely at the end of the A section, the first system. A little anticipation here in the melody too. Actually, these phrases are very similar to one another in terms of how they end. 5-6 of 5, 5-7 with the incomplete spelling, with omitting the 3rd, and our tonic G, B flat, D, and G. So maybe if this were our B section, this would be B prime. From a harmonic standpoint, there's similarities in the cadences. And then we get sort of a similar string of cadences going on here, with another very interesting cadence happening in the latter of the 2 phrases. So I think the first phrase that we get here ends in a half cadence, more specifically a Phrygian half cadence, and apologies if my handwriting looks a bit chunkier than the handwriting I usually have. I couldn't find my pencil today. It never leaves my desk, so maybe someone borrowed it. I don't know. But yeah, I can't seem to find my mechanical pencil, which is much easier to write more defined lines here, so hopefully my handwriting's still legible. I'm trying to do the best that I can here, but we're going to start off in the key of, in my opinion, B flat major. We have some interpretation here where we have G minor to start things off, which I think is operating as our 6th chord in the key of B flat major. And we have just one of these cases where we never get a direct reference to the key other than context clues. We have context that really only works in one key, and we never get a resolution. So sometimes it doesn't quite feel like we're in the key that we're modulating to, especially at the beginning of the phrase. There's really nothing inherently more C minor like about C7 than it is B flat major like, or even F major like. You could say we go to the key of F major here, if that makes sense, but to me the melody doesn't really feel like it wants to resolve to the key of F major. This feels much more B flat major like to me. So I do think we start off with C7 being a secondary dominant here, basically an intermediary chord between 6 and 5-6. It's very common to see 6 go to 5-6. In fact, I think we saw that progression earlier in the A section, 6-5-6-1. Very common phrase beginning to a lot of the phrases we see in Bach's chorale writing. So I think this is just a take on that. but 5-4-2 of 5, because C is the dominant of F, and F is our dominant, or our 5. And we would expect this to go to 5-6, which it does. A, C, F, and C. F major over A. And I think this just, with the chromatic baseline that we have going on here from B flat to G, I think this is just a case where 5 is actually turning into the major 4 in the key of C minor. And we're just seeing keys that are adjacent to one another regarding their roots, and they have similar key signatures. C flat having that C minor having that A flat there, which is sort of the tell, this Phrygian half cadence going on here. A flat, G, C, and C. You could analyze this as a 6-7 chord if you wanted to, if you see that G is the 7th of the chord, but I think that this F is actually the root of this chord. Namely speaking, about Phrygian half cadences, you usually find yourself in one of two situations. You find yourself in a situation where there isn't really any counterpoint going on, and it's just chord to chord, and virtually all of those cases include a 4 chord in first inversion. It's going to be a minor 4 chord going to a 5 chord. That's usually what it's going to be for pretty much every single time in Bach's chorales. But other times you have contrapuntal Phrygian half cadences where there are chords that can be interpreted or extrapolated from the texture that are somewhat related to 4-6. 6-7 is one of the culprits that we see a lot of the time, and we also see 2-4-3. So in this case, I think 6-7 would be a totally valid analysis. I couldn't mark someone, incorrect, like if we're just factually spelling the chords. But I think with context clues and knowing enough about the chorales, it makes more sense that the chord is a 4-6 chord. And then we end on our 5. G, D, B, natural, and D, which is our dominant. So it's interesting that we have two consecutive keys that never reference their tonic. In fact, we don't get any resolutions anywhere, just a string of keys moving from one to the other. And this next phrase is really the most interesting part of this chorale, because for starters, this is some type of half cadence, but I don't know whether or not it's in the key of G minor or if it's in the key of B flat major. The more that I think about it, I hear B major just because the bass sounds like B flat, A, B flat, and this E flat just wants to resolve down to D, and I feel like B flat major is just the logical resolution of this, but we get G minor on the next beat. It's really difficult to say what key we're in here, but I'm going to stick with my analysis where the phrase pivots to the key of B flat major at the end of it, despite starting in the key of G minor. So we get a direct modulation here where we start off with C, D, A, and D, which is another 5-4-2 chord, D7 without the third. We've seen this chord used a ton in this chorale. We would expect this to go to our tonic, which it kind of does, but as you can see, we have B natural here. And it's always these descending chromatic lines that have the most interesting harmonic configurations and progressions. We have B natural, D, G, and D. So the root resolves the way we would expect, but the bass, similar to how we resolved here from 6-4-2 to 5-6 of 5, we are getting a logical resolution here, which is not true of all the 4-2 chords we've had in this chorale. So even though we have 5-6 of 4 going on here, it's still 5-4-2 resolving to where we would expect. Maybe not the first place we would expect, but it makes sense because the root is the place we would expect in terms of the relationships between the two chords. It's just the quality of the chord goes against what we would expect. We would expect a G minor chord here, but we get G major, which further perpetuates a different narrative. But it gets even more interesting than that. We get some passing tones here which don't really allude to where we would expect, because obviously we would expect this chord to go to C minor. Maybe we would expect this chord to go to we would expect it to go to E flat major. No, we would expect it to go to A flat major, maybe. But instead of getting A flat major, we get a B flat major chord here. And this is not just a deceptive, secondary deceptive progression. We have just a very interesting relationship of chords going on here. And I think even though this B flat major is operating like 3 in the key of G minor, and we're just seeing the chord go somewhere that we wouldn't expect it to go entirely, that is. I think in the key of B flat major, this is being recontextualized as our tonic. It just is how it is. And the chord that we end on is not a 5 chord, it is a 7 chord, A, C, C, and E flat, a root position diminished chord as our final chord in the phrase. Very unusual for so many reasons. These chords, like I said, there's ways that you could interpret this in the key of G minor. We could stay in G minor the whole way and just say that this were our 3 chord here, and we cadenced on our 2 chord. I had to double, triple, quadruple check to see whether this phrase was transcribed correctly, and it was. So there's definitely this muddying between the idea of G minor being the case here and this being a half cadence on a 2 chord, which is very interesting. But I think here, just because of the way the bass resolves, I'm really erring more on the side of this being in the key of B flat and this just being an unstable phrase that's just filled with dominance. And if there is any semblance of a key going on here, it is B flat, because B flat is being succeeded by a chord that has a dominant function in relation to it, and it's a root position 7 chord, which is kind of uncommon in Bach's handwriting, or in his chorale writing, sorry. I would presume he handwrote all of his chorales. But moving on to the next phrase, we're going to take the chorale out in the key of G minor. It's fairly straightforward, perfect authentic cadence like we would expect. We start off with G minor. We have basically all of the makings of a B flat major chord that would make this phrase make a little bit more sense, but no, we get a deceptive progression: B flat, D, G, and D. Had this been an F, it would make a lot more sense, but it is a G, so this is a 6-6 chord in the key of B flat major. It also happens to be a 1-6 chord in the key of G minor, and basically all is well with the world at this point. But yes, there is a bit of a typo going on here. This is actually supposed to be a G natural. There is a big voice cross between the tenor and the bass here. I think the bass got copied into the tenor here when I was doing the MIDI. One of the downsides of all of these chorales that are sort of auxiliary additions to the BWV numbers is the fact that MIDI for them doesn't really exist for them online, at least anywhere that I could find. So it is kind of interesting that I have to input them myself. It's been more than a year since I've had to build the MIDI for my, or build the scores. I had to transcribe all of the score information from just from looking at the score for me to print out. And yeah, I'm very error prone, so if some typos make it through, I'm going to try and fix all of them by the time we get to the final recording. But if we do encounter any typos that don't get caught in the video making process, please comment them in the comment section below. That would be really helpful for me and helpful for anyone who's trying to use these chorales for their own edification or their own research purposes. So we have a neighbor tone here in the alto, but before that we have C, G, G, and C, another open 5th chord, and really it's been a toss-up between major 4 and minor 4. It's really 6 of one, half dozen of another here. It's a root position 4 chord. It could be major or minor at this point, but really it doesn't matter too much. C sharp, E, G, and B flat. That is a fully diminished 7th chord. Secondary dominant 7-7 of 5, because C sharp's the leading tone to D, and D is our dominant or our 5. We then get a little non-chord tone here on the and of beat 2 here in the alto, and then we get D major, like we would expect, without the 3rd, D, A, D, and A, just an open 5th. Passing 7th on the bass, and then we get B flat, G, D, and B flat, which is our tonic triad in first inversion, G minor, and the chord briefly turns into root position on the end of the beat 2 with G, D, D, and B flat, and it's fully spelled, no open 5th. We then get this cadential ending that we've seen a handful of times in this chorale, with the substitute for 2 being 5 of 5, C sharp, A, E, and A, 5/6 of 5, A major rather than A minor, or in this case A diminished because we get E natural and C sharp. Passing tone here in the tenor, D, C natural, D, and A. Another one of these open 5/7/5 chords like we've seen previously, and then we get our anticipation here in the melody, and then our major tonic triad, because this is the end of the chorale after all, G, B natural, D, and G. G major. Bach often ends his minor chorales with a Picardy third. We don't even know if Bach composed this, so it's difficult to say. Nevertheless, it is a Bach chorale because it made its way into the collection, and it's really interesting to see how this chorale compares and contrasts with the rest of Bach's writing. There's definitely something off. I didn't read the comments on the BachChorales.com website entry for this particular chorale until after I had analyzed it, so there are a lot of things that were off in my head about this too, and there are a couple of chorales that actually slipped into the main bulk of the chorales, like the first 400 or so BWV numbers. That were a little bit suspicious sometimes, but really I think the description on the website is pretty much hits the nail on the head for this one. But as far as takeaways are concerned, there are several. Some of the tamer things: we have our tonic operating as 5 of 4 in a couple of occasions in this chorale. We have 5 of 4 going on here. I said a couple. Is it only one? Maybe it's only one. Oh, you know what? Originally I had this analyzed as a G7 chord rather than a B diminished chord. So we do have our tonic operating as 5 of 4 just once in this chorale. Afterwards, we have this idea of the irregular 4/2 resolution. 7/4/2 typically would go to 3/6, but here we have it going to 5 in root position, which is similar to 3/6, but instead we have A natural rather than B flat, and in this case we have F sharp, so that might be a difference to whether or not the 3 chord would be augmented or major. Then we have a bunch of open fifths in this chorale. That's the big anomaly about this chorale and kind of the red flag as to whether or not this chorale is valid in terms of the authenticity of the composer. Did Bach compose this? It's plausible. It's also unlikely. I don't know. It's difficult to say. I don't think that I have the authority to make that final decision, but there's definitely some wonky stuff going on in the bass that just kind of challenges my intuition about the chorales. But other than that, we also have some unusual authentic cadences: 3/5/1, 3/5/1, and on that same sort of token, I guess, we have unusual half cadence here with 1 going to 7 or 3 going to 2, depending on how you analyze it. Either way, this half cadence is very unusual, amongst the most unusual cadences we've seen in the chorales as far as diatonic cadences are concerned. Other ones are just difficult to analyze in their own ways, but this one is difficult in terms of knowing what key we're in. Are we still in the key of G minor at this point? Are we in the key of B flat major at this point? If the key relationships from previous points in the chorale is any indicator, I'm inclined to believe we're in the key of B flat, but like I said, it's difficult to know for sure. And of course, the chromatic bass lines we've seen, we see them all over the place, starting off with a very unusual one, E natural, E flat, D. But if you do a little bit of examination and see that the line is sort of transferred from voice to voice, it makes a bit more sense. But we see chromatic bass lines all throughout this chorale: E flat, E natural. Sorry, this is not a chromatic bass line. If this were an F natural, it were, but plenty of chromaticism in the bass. B flat, A flat, G, C, B natural, B flat, A, C natural, C sharp, D. It's tons of chromatic bass lines, and especially the descending chromatic bass lines are the ones that provide the most unique harmony when looking at Bach's chorales as a whole. So there was a ton to talk about in this chorale, which is why a chorale of pretty much average length in comparison to the rest of the chorales that I've analyzed. That's why the video is as long as it is. So thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification icon if you liked the content. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.